She stood in the center of the grand ballroom and felt completely invisible. The chandeliers above Ashbourne Hall blazed with 1,000 candles, throwing golden light over silk gowns and glittering jewels. Laughter rippled through the crowd, glasses clinked, and the string quartet played a waltz that made the floor hum beneath Eleanor's satin slippers. She was the Duchess of Ashbourne. This was her first public reception since the wedding, and she had spent hours preparing, her heart beating with fragile hope. But Julian Ashbourne, the Duke of Ashbourne, stood across the room with his back half-turned to her. He hadn't looked at her once since the guests arrived. He spoke to Lord Whitmore about grain tariffs, nodded to Lady Pemberton about the upcoming hunting season, and placed his hand briefly on the shoulder of an old military friend. Eleanor waited. She waited for his gaze to find her, for the smallest gesture that would tell the room she mattered to him. It never came. Beside her, an older woman murmured behind her fan, "Poor thing. Married 6 weeks and already a ghost in her own home." The words landed like a cold stone in Eleanor's stomach. She kept her chin high, her smile gentle, because that was what a duchess did. Inside, something cracked. Her fingers drifted to the thin chain around her neck, hidden beneath the lace of her bodice, where a small silver locket rested against her skin. Inside that locket was a tiny pressed rose, faded now but still holding the faintest blush of pink. She had worn that locket every day for 12 years, ever since a boy with gray eyes and a bleeding hand had pulled her from a rushing river and pressed it into her palm. He had been perhaps 13, she barely 8. He had torn his hand on a rock rescuing her, and when she'd sobbed in fear, he'd given her the locket and said, "Keep this. I'll find you one day. I promise." She had believed him with every cell of her child's heart. And when, years later, she saw the Duke of Ashbourne at a country assembly and noticed the thin white scar snaking across his right palm, her heart nearly stopped. She had been so certain. This was the boy. This was her destiny. And now she was his wife, drowning in a sea of glittering strangers, and he didn't even see her. The ache in her chest spread slowly, hot and heavy. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach and breathed through it. This was not how the dream was supposed to end. A footman approached and murmured that the Duchess was needed in the supper room. Eleanor nodded and moved through the crowd like a wraith. As she passed Julian, she caught the familiar scent of sandalwood and leather, and for one dizzy second she thought he might stop her, might rest his hand on her elbow. He simply stepped aside to let her pass, his eyes never leaving his companion. Hope was a fragile thing. Eleanor felt it splinter inside her, sharp and splintered glass. She did not cry that night. She sat before the mirror in her bedchamber while her lady's maid, quiet and efficient, brushed out her hair. Eleanor's reflection showed a woman with warm brown eyes, high cheekbones, and a mouth that trembled only slightly. She was not a great beauty, but she had always thought her face was kind. Kindness, however, did not seem to be a currency the Duke of Ashbourne valued. When the maid left, Eleanor opened the locket and looked at the dried rose. She could still remember the cold water closing over her head, the terror, and then the strong arms lifting her, the boy's voice steady and calm. "You're safe now. I won't let go." She had built an entire future on those words. It was time to accept that the boy who spoke them no longer existed, if he ever had. Eleanor snapped the locket shut and tucked it beneath her pillow. She would not wear it again. She would not spend her days aching for a promise the Duke clearly did not remember making. She would be a duchess in name, a partner in duty and nothing more. The weeks that followed were a careful exercise in erasing hope. Eleanor threw herself into the management of Ashbourne Hall. She learned the names of every servant, visited the tenants' cottages, and spent long afternoons with the estate steward reviewing accounts. She was gracious at dinner, perfectly composed at the few social calls she received, and never once sought out her husband's company unless duty demanded it. Julian seemed relieved. He remained polite, distant, and endlessly occupied. The Duke was a man carved from stone, all sharp angles and unreadable expressions. His gray eyes, the very same gray she had remembered with such longing, now felt like winter clouds, offering no warmth. He spoke to her about household matters, inquired after her comfort, and then disappeared into his study or rode out across the fields for hours. At first, Elinor watched him go with a hollow ache. She would stand at the window of the morning room and follow his tall figure until it vanished into the tree line. She wondered what he thought about, whether he ever thought of her, whether the scar on his palm ever tingled with a lost memory. But wondering was a slow poison, so she made herself stop. She began spending her mornings in the village. There was a small orphanage at the edge of Ashbourne lands, a drafty stone building that housed 17 children and one exhausted matron. Elinor visited once out of ducal duty and found herself returning the next day, and the next. She read to the children, helped scrub floors, and sat with the littlest ones while they cried for mothers who would never return. No one at the orphanage cared that she was a duchess. They just needed her to be present. For the first time in her marriage, Elinor felt something loosen in her chest. She was useful. She was seen. It was there, in the sunlit courtyard of the orphanage, that she met Lord Henry Vance. He was a widower, gentle-eyed and soft-spoken, who had been funding the orphanage's coal supply for years. He did not flatter her or treat her with the careful deference of someone handling a duke's neglected wife. He simply handed her a pail of whitewash one afternoon when she arrived to find the children repainting the garden wall, and said, "You look like someone who could use a brush." Elinor laughed. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed. She took the brush. Julian noticed the change before he understood it. At first, it was a small thing. She stopped waiting for him at breakfast. He would come down to the dining room and find her plate already cleared, a single flower from the garden lying beside his cup as a silent, dutiful gesture. She no longer lingered in the hallway when he returned from his ride, no longer asked about his day with that hopeful, searching look that had always made him want to look away. He should have been relieved. He had married Elinor Whitmore because it was a sound political alliance. Because his mother's deathbed wish had been to see the Ashbourne line secured, and because he had once loved a woman so fiercely that, when she left him for a richer title, he had sworn never to feel anything again. A wife who expected nothing was exactly what he wanted. But Julian found himself standing at the window, watching her walk down the long drive toward the village with a straw bonnet swinging from her fingers, and something uncomfortable twisted in his gut. She looked lighter. She smiled at the gardener, laughed with the stable boy, and once she waved at someone Julian could not see beyond the gate. She had never smiled at him like that. He told himself it was possessiveness, nothing more. She was his duchess. Her attention should belong to him even if he did not want it. It was a base, selfish thought, and he hated himself for it. Then he heard the name Henry Vance from his steward. "Lord Vance has been most generous with the orphanage, Your Grace. The Duchess seems to enjoy his company. They often paint together." Paint together? Julian's jaw tightened until he heard a dull pop in his ear. He had not touched a paintbrush since his mother died. The thought of another man sitting beside his wife in the sunshine, sharing quiet moments he had never bothered to offer, sent a bolt of jealousy through him so sharp it left him breathless. That night at dinner, he broke his own rule. "I understand you've been spending time with Lord Vance," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Elinor looked up from her soup. Her expression did not flicker. "He has been kind enough to assist with the orphanage repairs. The children adore him." "The children?" "Yes." She met his eyes directly, and there was no challenge in her gaze, only a calm, quiet distance. "He lost his own wife 5 years ago. He says the orphans remind him that love is still possible." The word love hung in the air between them like a struck bell. Julian set his spoon down. "You speak of love with a man who is not your husband." Elinor tilted her head. "I speak of love with a man who is not afraid of the word." She rose from her chair with perfect grace. "If you'll excuse me, Your Grace, I promised the children an early story tomorrow. I should rest." She left him sitting alone at the long, empty table. Julian stared at the candle flame until his vision blurred. "Your Grace." She had called him Julian once, on their wedding night, her voice trembling with nervous hope. He had not corrected her, but he had not answered to it either. He had simply turned away and told her she need not wait up for him. He had been so determined not to love her. It had never occurred to him that she might stop loving him first. The fever came with the autumn rains. It swept through the village like a silent thief, taking the weakest first. The orphanage was hit hard. Alina heard the news from a breathless footman just as she was sitting down to her morning correspondence, and she was out the door before the young man could finish his sentence. Julian tried to stop her. He caught her arm in the entrance hall, his grip firm but not painful. "You are not going there. Send the physician, send supplies, but you will not put yourself at risk." Alina pulled her arm free. "They are children, Julian. They are frightened and sick, and I will not sit in this house while they suffer." It was the first time she had said his name in months. The sound of it hit him like a physical blow. For one suspended heartbeat, he saw something crack behind his gray eyes, something raw and terrified. But Alina was already pulling on her cloak, already calling for the carriage. "Alina," his voice dropped low and rough, "please." She paused at the door. "You have spent our entire marriage asking me to stay at a distance. You do not get to ask me to stay now." The carriage rolled away into the gray rain, and Julian stood in the doorway long after it disappeared, his chest heaving with a fear he could not name. For 5 days, Alina did not come home. She slept in a chair at the orphanage, waking every few hours to press cool cloths to burning foreheads, to spoon broth between chapped lips, to hold small hands while the fever raged and broke. The matron wept with exhaustion and gratitude. Lord Vance came and went, bringing firewood and clean linens, his presence steady and undemanding. On the third night, Alina's own strength began to waver. Her head throbbed, her throat burned, but she swallowed the symptoms down and kept moving. She could not stop. There was a little girl named Daisy, barely 5 years old, who cried for her mother in her sleep. Alina held her through the worst of it, rocking and singing a lullaby her own mother had sung long ago. "Stay with me," Daisy whimpered. "Don't leave." "I'm here," Alina whispered, her voice cracking. "I won't let go." The words echoed from another life, another promise, and something inside Alina's heart quietly gave way. She closed her eyes and let the fever take her. Julian arrived at the orphanage in the dead of night, drenched from the rain, his face a mask of barely contained terror. He had held out for 5 days. 5 days of packing his study, snapping at servants, staring at the empty chair across from him at dinner. On the 5th evening, a messenger arrived with word that the Duchess had collapsed. Julian did not remember saddling his horse. He did not remember the ride. He only remembered the moment he stepped into the dim, candle-lit room and saw her lying on a narrow cot, her dark hair plastered to her damp forehead, her skin pale as milk. Lord Vance was there, sitting vigil at her side. Julian's vision went red. "Get out," he said, his voice deadly quiet. Vance rose slowly. He was a man of peace, but his eyes held a quiet judgment that cut deeper than any blade. "She asked for you," he said. "Before the fever took her senses, she asked if you had come." Julian felt the words like a knife between his ribs. Vance left without another sound. Julian sank into the chair beside the cot and took Alina's hand. It was burning hot, fragile in his grip. He pressed his forehead to her knuckles and squeezed his eyes shut. "I'm here," he choked out. "I'm here now. Please, Alina, please don't leave me." She did not stir. The physician came and went, his expression grave. The fever was deep, dangerous. All they could do was wait and pray. Julian did not leave her side. He bathed her face with lavender water, talked to her in a low, broken voice, and watched the shallow rise and fall of her chest with desperate, unblinking eyes. The children, those who were well enough, crept to the doorway and stared at the big, stern Duke who held the Duchess's hand like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. On the second night of her unconsciousness, Julian was searching her cloak for her handkerchief when his fingers brushed against something cold. A thin silver chain. He pulled it out and saw the locket. He had not seen it in 12 years, but he knew it instantly. The sight of it slammed the breath from his lungs. He fumbled the tiny clasp open with shaking fingers, and there it was. A pressed pink rose, brittle and faded, the twin to the one he had kept locked in his desk drawer for over a decade. The one he had not looked at since the day after his mother's funeral, when he had locked away every memory of that sunlit riverbank, and the little girl with terrified brown eyes because remembering felt too much like happiness, and he had not believed he deserved happiness. She had kept it, she had waited. And he had not remembered. No, that was a lie. He had remembered. He had seen the scar on his palm every single day. He had simply chosen to bury the memory so deep that it could not hurt him, and in doing so, he had hurt the one person who had held onto that promise with her whole heart. Julian pressed the locket to his lips and wept. When Elena finally opened her eyes, the world was soft and grey with early morning light. Her body felt hollow, her throat raw, but the fire in her veins had cooled to a distant ember. The first thing she saw was Julian. He was slumped in a chair beside her, his head resting on the edge of her cot, his dark hair disheveled, his shirt wrinkled and open at the collar. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. In his hand, pressed against his chest, was her locket. Elena's heart stuttered. She tried to speak, but only a dry whisper came out. Julian. He snapped awake instantly, gray eyes wild and red-rimmed. He stared at her for one breathless moment, as if he could not believe she was real, and then his face crumpled. He lifted her hand to his mouth and kissed her fingers, her palm, her wrist, his tears falling hot and unchecked. "You're awake," he said, the words ragged. "Thank God you're awake." Elena watched him, too weak to pull away, too stunned to speak. The Duke she knew did not cry. The Duke she knew did not cling to her hand like a drowning man. He opened the locket and held it up so she could see. "You kept it. All this time you kept it." Her eyes filled slowly. "You remember." "I never forgot." His voice broke on the confession. "I made myself forget. I didn't want to remember that day because it was the last day I felt truly happy before my mother died. I was so afraid of losing people I loved that I built walls around my heart and refused to let anyone in, especially you, because you had the power to destroy those walls and I was a coward." Elena's tears slid silently into her hair. "I thought you didn't want me." "I wanted you from the moment you walked into Ashburn Hall," he said, raw and honest. "I was terrified of it. I convinced myself duty was enough, that distance was safer. And then I watched you pull away and I told myself it was what I deserved. But when I saw you with Vance, He stopped, his jaw working. "I have never been so jealous in my life. I have never been so afraid of losing something I was too proud to claim." She looked at him, this man who had been a stranger in her marriage, and saw the boy from the river at last. The same gray eyes, the same fierce, trembling courage. "I stopped waiting for you," she whispered. "I thought if I stopped hopping it would hurt less." "Did it?" "No," a tear slipped down her cheek. "It just hurt differently." Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. From it, he drew an identical silver locket, worn and tarnished with age. He opened it to reveal a matching pink rose, pressed flat and fragile, still holding its color after all these years. "I kept mine too," he said. "I couldn't throw it away. It was the only pure thing I had left. I just didn't have the courage to let it mean something." Elena stared at the twin lockets, and the weight of 12 years of waiting pressed against her ribs. The pain was still there, but it was no longer cold. It was warm, aching, alive. "I loved you too late," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I love you now. I love you with everything I have, everything I locked away. If you'll let me, I will spend the rest of my life proving it." She was silent for a long moment. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the first pale rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds. The children's voices drifted in from the courtyard, high and bright with laughter. Elena reached out with her weak, trembling hand and touched the scar on his palm. The scar he had gotten saving her life. "You didn't love me too late," she said softly. "You loved me at the river. You loved me when you gave me this locket. You just forgot how to feel it, but I remember. And I think we can learn together." Julian closed his eyes and pressed his forehead to hers, his shoulders shaking with a sob he could no longer hold back. She felt the warmth of him, the solid, real presence of the man she had dreamed of for so long, and something inside her chest opened like a flower turning toward the sun. "Stay with me," he murmured against her skin. She smiled, small and fragile but true. "I'm not going anywhere." The days of recovery passed slowly, tenderly. Julian moved Elena back to Ushbun Hall as soon as the physician permitted, but he did not retreat to his study or his fields. He sat beside her bed and read to her from her favorite books. He brought the children from the orphanage to visit, filling the grand hall with their sticky fingers and delighted squeals. He held her hand during the long, quiet afternoons when she was too tired to speak, his thumb tracing slow circles on her skin. And he told her everything. He told her about the woman he had loved before, the one who had chosen a marquis over a young duke with a grieving heart. He told her about his mother, whose slow decline had hollowed him out until he forgot what hope felt like. He told her how, on the morning after their wedding, he had stood in the doorway of her bedchamber and watched her sleep, and something inside him had cracked open with terrifying, overwhelming tenderness. He had run from it. He had been running ever since. Elena listened, and she did not flinch from any of it. She was still too thin, still pale from the fever, but her eyes held a steady, quiet strength that humbled him. "We both built walls," she said one evening, as the sunset painted the bedchamber in shades of rose and gold. "Mine were made of hope, yours were made of fear. Neither of them protected us." He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Then let's tear them down, brick by brick." "Together," she said. "Together." Lord Henry Vance came to call once, 3 weeks after Elena's recovery. He brought a small bouquet of wildflowers and a book of poetry the children had insisted the Duchess would enjoy. Julian received him in the drawing room with a civility that cost him more than he would ever admit. When Vance asked after Elena, Julian's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. "She is resting. I will give her your regards." Vance studied the Duke's face for a long moment, and something that looked like quiet acceptance settled in his expression. "She is a remarkable woman, Your Grace. You are very fortunate." "I know," Julian said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Vance nodded once and took his leave. He did not return. That night Julian found Elena in the garden, sitting on the stone bench beneath the old willow tree. She was wrapped in a thick shawl, her face tilted up toward the stars. He sat beside her without a word and draped his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him naturally, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Lord Vance brought you flowers," he said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Elena laughed softly. "They were from the children, he only carried them." Julian grunted. She turned her head to look at him, her brown eyes warm and knowing. "You were jealous." "I was insufferably jealous," he admitted. "I will likely be jealous of every man who so much as glances at you for the rest of my life." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "But you are worth it." She reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers light against the rough stubble. "I only ever wanted you, Julian. From the moment you pulled me from that river, I belonged to you, not because you saved me, but because you were kind. You were kind to a frightened little girl you didn't know, and you gave her a promise. I built my heart around that promise. I just needed you to remember it." "I remember now." He turned his face into her palm. "I will never forget again." The first snow of winter came in late November, blanketing Ashbourne lands in silent white. Alina stood at the window of the master bedchamber, their bedchamber now, and watched the flakes drift past the glass. Julian came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "I have something for you," he murmured. He opened his hand and revealed a new chain, delicate gold this time, with both silver lockets threaded onto it. He had polished them until they gleamed, and the tiny roses inside were sealed behind fresh glass to preserve them forever. Alina's breath caught. "You joined them." "They belong together," he said simply, "just like us." He fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck with exquisite gentleness. The lockets rested against her heart, one over the other, a double weight that felt like an anchor and a lifeline all at once. Alina turned in his arms and looked up at him. This man who had been a stranger, then a ghost, then a heartbreak, and finally her home. His gray eyes held the same light she had seen that day by the river, steady and true. "I love you," she said, the words no longer fragile, no longer waiting. "I love you too," he said. "I loved you too late, but I will love you for the rest of my life, and that is exactly on time." She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was soft, unhurried, a promise sealed not with desperation but with deep, abiding peace. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in quiet grace. Inside Ashbourne Hall, the Duke and his Duchess held each other, and the lockets between them caught the firelight and glowed like two small, beating hearts. And neither of them felt invisible anymore. That spring, Alina planted a rose garden on the grounds of the orphanage. Julian helped her dig the beds, his shirt sleeves rolled up, dirt smeared across his cheek. The children shrieked and tumbled around them, and Daisy, now healthy and bright-eyed, insisted on carrying the watering can all by herself. Lord Vance sent a card from London, where he had gone to visit family, and enclosed a packet of seeds with a single line, "For the Duchess who paints her own sunshine." Alina showed the card to Julian with a raised eyebrow. He scowled. "The man is relentless. He is kind. He is relentless." But Julian did not throw the seeds away. He helped her plant them along the garden wall, and when the first shoots pushed through the soil, he was the one who noticed. "Look," he said, pulling her outside one misty morning. "They're growing." Alina knelt beside the tiny green sprouts, her heart swelling until it pressed against her ribs. She looked up at her husband, this man who had once locked his heart away, and saw the quiet wonder in his eyes. "Everything grows," she said, "if you give it a chance." He knelt beside her in the damp grass, uncaring of the stains on his fine trousers, and took her hand. "Then let's give everything a chance, every day, every moment." She smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had stopped waiting and started living. Every moment. From the orphanage window, the children watched the Duke and Duchess kneeling together in the garden, their heads bent close, their hands intertwined. And though the children could not hear the words, they felt the warmth of what passed between them, a quiet, steady glow that promised good things to come. Daisy pressed her nose to the glass and whispered, "The Duchess is happy." She was. She was finally, completely, irreversibly happy. And across the garden, Julian lifted Alina's hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her scarred palm, and knew with absolute certainty that the boy who had pulled her from the river had finally, truly, come home.